Hello and welcome to JSB Talks Digital, the podcast for marketers, bloggers, business owners, and those of you bringing your skills into the digital age. I'm Joanne Sweeney-Burke, and this podcast is brought to you by Digital Training Institute. Today's show is dedicated to podcasting. Podcast listening is showing sharp gains, and in a recent US study, 21% of survey respondents said they listen to podcasts monthly, while 13% said they tune into a podcast weekly. Also coming up in today's show, in social media news, Twitter introduces 360-degree live video streaming, Facebook launches a new guide on how to use 360-degree video on their platform, and I share new data on how we are using social media in Ireland. I interview Owen Murphy about his 5-year podcasting career, as well as Colin Gray, founder of The Podcast Host. Shoutouts to JSB's favourite podcasts, my featured column, My Podcasting Routine, and find out what podcasting tool saved my working week.
Social media news.
Following in Facebook's footsteps, Twitter has announced they are entering the 360-degree video landscape vis-a-vis Periscope. When you see a video marked with a live 360 badge, you can interact with it to change what you see by moving your phone or swiping the screen, all while watching live. See what's unfolding behind, above, or below the broadcaster's view for an immersive experience. Although everyone on Twitter and Periscope can watch live 360 videos, currently only select partners can go live in 360 via Periscope. In collaboration with the Associated Press, Facebook has launched a new guide on how to use 360-degree video. The Associated Press is an independent, non-profit news cooperative headquartered in New York City. They have journalists in over 100 countries to tell the world's stories, from breaking news to investigative reporting. They provide content and services to help engage audiences worldwide, working with companies of all types, from broadcasters to brands. They suggest the following 6 tips when using 360-degree video on Facebook. Firstly, think of the camera as a person. Then find a unique angle. Shoot between 1 and 6 meters away. Be careful of moving the camera while filming. Shoot for at least 1 minute. And finally, keep experimenting. Download the full guide on the blog associated with this podcast at digitaltraining.ie. Digital marketing columnist and consultant Shane O'Leary has been producing much needed data on how we consume and engage digitally here in Ireland. This research is warmly welcomed by me and my peers in the industry who are hungry for this information. I'll have Shane on episode 31 of the podcast, but as a teaser, let me share some top-line social media stats with you. Did you know 67% of Irish people use Facebook? Of those, 74% use it daily. On average, Irish people spend 5 hours and 40 minutes per week on Facebook. On average, Irish people spend 1.31 hours on social media each day. On average, Irish people have 5.6 active social media accounts. 25% of Irish people follow their favourite brands on social media. Meanwhile, 35% of Irish people have reviewed a product online in the last month. More insights from Shane when he joins me in the next episode, so you won't want to miss that.
Interview.
In today's show, I'm delighted to be joined by Owen Murphy, my podcast producer. Owen has been podcasting for the past 5 years, and his gaming website is hitstartnow.com, while his podcast is the HSN Podcast. Hey Owen, it's great to have you on my podcast, even though you've been sitting here quietly for the past 30 shows. And like me, you're a journalist. How did you get into podcasting?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show, Joanne. I really appreciate it. I first got into podcasting, it's kind of the classic Irish tale, if you will. I met a guy in a bar one night and we started talking about podcasts. I was never into podcasts beforehand. I'd never really heard of them. I kind of came from a writing background. I did a lot of writing, all kind of video game orientated. And I got talking to this one guy. He decided, well, why don't we hook up together and make a website where we can do podcasting, do writing, do blogs, do all sorts of news articles and whatever else might go with it, and see what happens. And the rest, as they say, is history, because, well, that was 5+ years ago at this stage, and we're still doing it now. That particular person doesn't do it with me anymore, but that's how I initially took the dive into podcasting.
Were you ahead of your time? Like, I'm only podcasting for like half a year, and you've been doing it like for 5 years.
I'm not sure if I'd say I was ahead of my time, because where you'd have the rest of the background there with you for promotion and so on and so forth, we didn't. We were kind of punk, if you will. You know, we did everything from scratch, and we weren't sure if we were doing it right or not. You know, as far as listening to anything even remotely similar went, my taste wouldn't be kind of your general podcast. My taste would be radio chat shows. You know, so that's the background that I personally would be coming from. And my mate then was doing it the opposite way altogether. He was coming from listening to gaming podcasts and kind of a tech background. I've got a huge passion for video games. I have had since I was a child. I've got a collection of like 700 plus. It's ridiculous, you know. So I've kind of got the gaming knowledge to back me up, but the podcasting side of things I wasn't so sure about, because I was coming from kind of an argumentative, if you will, radio show kind of scene. So yeah, were we ahead of our time? I'd say no, because we were scrubs, if you will. You know, we were probably doing everything wrong for at least 2 years before we found our footing.
But isn't that the best way to learn? By just doing it and getting things wrong. So like 5 years on, I approached you and I said, Owen, I want to start a podcast. I do have a radio background. Yeah, I'm in the business of digital marketing and social media, so I know promotion and I know how to get it out there. But I have no idea about the technical side. Can you help me? So I think all the advice that you have given me from those early years of making mistakes have absolutely proved invaluable. But talk to me about the passion and the podcast and the role that passion plays in, for us podcasters, in launching our podcasts.
I think it's hugely important. I think it's pivotal, in fact. I don't think there's much point in doing a podcast about something that you're not 100% behind, you don't 100% believe in. Like I said, for me, it's video games. I've been a video game fan since I was a kid. I've spent all my teens playing video games, and that's always been my passion, with video games and music. So it's something that I can completely get behind because I'm well educated on the topic, if you will. I think if it's not something that you are well educated on and indeed you enjoy, well, then you might have to rethink your topic of conversation for your podcast. I think you might be going down the wrong route, because I think, again, enjoyment is a huge part of it. It's because it's got to be passionate, doesn't it? You know, there's not a whole lot in not a whole lot of point in jumping behind the mic and talking about things that you only kind of half care about yourself. You've got to care about it. You've got to really get in behind it for the listener to also care. And if the listener doesn't care, again, you're kind of kicking yourself.
Because there's a lot of work and a lot of commitment to producing and delivering a weekly podcast. When it comes to building your community, by virtue of you being in the gaming world and you know the whole gaming world, did you start with a whole audience, captive audience, or did it take you 5 years to build up your audience?
It took quite a while to build up my audience, because I wasn't embedded in the community then the way I am now. Through external outfits, like Galway Gaming Tribes, for example, and many other kind of little bits and pieces around the country, I organise and kind of produce gaming events now. So I've kind of wormed my way into the community, you know, and made sure that I was as big a part of the community as I can be. Galway Gaming Tribes, for example, happens here in Galway every Monday night, where we get an average of about 50 players getting together just to play some video games and some board games and to enjoy their Monday night and meet new people and become a community. Through things like that, that kind of helped. It wasn't a case of, okay, I'm already in there, I can start off now and hit start now will do well. No, we kind of had to claw at start and move our way up. Luckily enough, we had a lot of kind of friends who were also gamers and their friends were gamers. And the way gamers work is it's a community in itself in the way of, let's talk about online gaming, for example. If I was to go online now, I'd be one of a team of 6 players, for example. So if I was to say it to those 6 players, they might say it to their next team and so on. So it kind of builds up that way, and that in itself is kind of lucky.
Now, so the podcast has helped you infiltrate the gaming community because it's given you trust, credibility. What about monetization? Because I know I started this podcast and the passion that drove me, much like yourself, and it wasn't the money that has driven me, and it still doesn't because I don't monetize my podcast. However, it's given me some amazing business opportunities indirectly. Where do you stand on making money out of podcasts, or that being a driving factor in launching one?
I wish that was a driving factor, to be perfectly honest, Joanne. If I was to tell you now that I made money out of HitStart now, it wouldn't be truthful. What I have gotten from HitStart now is a leverage on journalism as a whole. I never set out to be a journalist. I accidentally became a journalist. I started off, as I said, through HitStart now, doing podcasts just for fun, and from then I found myself interviewing 1 or 2 people, and these were people that I looked up to, so they were big steps, whether they were in other people's eyes or not. In my eyes, they were. And from there, then I decided, wow, this is what I'm good at, if you will, and found myself studying journalism from there. So does the site itself make money for me? No, unfortunately it doesn't, but it has kind of segued me into other things that led to money. For example, I work in radio now, which that pays for itself, and other bits and pieces like that. But no, the website itself, unfortunately, does not make the cash.
And I guess that's good advice to people. Don't start off and launch something like a podcast because you think it's going to bring you money. I think that the key message is make sure that the passion is there, and the rest will come. Now, I asked you to write a guest blog post for me for digitaltraininginstitute.ie on podcast tips for beginners, which I have on the blog right now. What 3 top tips would you give to beginner podcasters who are tuned in?
First of all, I'd say, as I've mentioned already, make sure it's something that you are well educated on. Don't go in with half an idea. Go in with something that you're passionate about. Go in with something that you want to tell the world about, that you want to turn around and say, hey, you know what I love? And make sure that's your driving force. If not, it just wouldn't make for good audio, wouldn't make for good radio. Secondly, I'd say, as we just mentioned there a second ago, go in free first. Don't go in with the idea of, this is my podcast, it's going to be huge, I'm going to make a lot of money. Instead, go in with the mindset of, this is my podcast because I want to share love and news about whatever my passion is. And to do that, I'd recommend using, if you're producing your own podcast, for example, I'd recommend using the likes of Audacity, which is a free download sound editing program, instead of jumping straight in and maybe tripping up, or maybe even finding out after a week or 2 of recording that podcasting isn't for you and it isn't as much fun as you thought it was going to be. So I reckon, start off by doing it free, get free downloads, get free programs like Audacity, check them out, make sure you know how to work that and how to produce a show. Basically, everything you need to find out these days, you can pretty much find out online anyway. So I'd highly recommend that instead of jumping in for $ straight off. And I reckon third, for somebody who's beginning, would be, don't necessarily upload your first podcast. a lot of people have a hard time finding their footing on the first show, and a lot of the time it shows. We made that mistake when we started off first. We recorded a huge set and just posted it and said, that's us. We didn't look into it as hard as we should. I would recommend definitely double thinking it before uploading your first show.
Okay, great tips. Luckily, I could upload my first show because I had Owen producing it and helping me out. And if you're stuck, and if, like me, you don't have enough time to produce your own show, then I would recommend hiring Owen. So if you want to find out more about his website, it's hit-start-now.com. And where can we find the HSN podcast, Owen?
You can find the HSN podcast on hitstartnow.com. You can also find it on iTunes. You can, as I said, download it directly from the site, and you can find it on Mixcloud as well for streaming.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining me, Owen.
Thank you very much for having me.
Interview.
I'm also joined on the show today by Colin Gray, founder of the Podcast Host. Based in Dundee in Scotland, Colin and his team provide novice and experienced podcasters with the skills to launch, grow, promote and monetize your podcast. They also offer training courses, production and mentorship. Colin, you're very welcome to JSB Talks Digital. Thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's an honour.
Well, it was great to find you on Twitter. I love Twitter as a social network. But tell our listeners a little bit about you and what you do.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my background's in education, actually. I got into podcasting because I was teaching lecturers how to podcast to teach their students a long way back, and eventually morphed into running courses for people outside of education as well. And all of that transformed into, over the years, over the last 5 years really, into the Podcast Host, which is the company I run these days, where our aim really is to help anyone start a podcast. We put out lots of free content, lots of blogging, lots of podcasts, lots of videos, and we run a couple of courses as well. So yeah, we try and help anyone we can just to start a podcast, get more great audio content out there into the world.
So as we know as podcasters, podcasting is growing in popularity, probably powered in part by the ever-expanding proliferation of smartphones, digital audio behaviours such as listening to online radio and streaming music. Tell us about the Podcast Hosts. Did you spot a gap in the market for some professional services for podcasters?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way we got into the professional services originally was I was writing a lot about podcasting as a hobby, really. It was my job at the university, and I just wrote articles about everything I was learning, really, how to improve a podcast, how to create great content. And people just started getting in touch and asking for help. And I think it was just, like you say, it was just when podcasting was starting to grow much more popular, people were getting into it, but there was a lot of questions around the area. There wasn't much content on podcasting. And people, obviously, many people will read the content for free, but many people just want help with it. And we got so many questions around editing skills, around the equipment to choose. It's quite a technical thing, really, to outside viewers. Like, before you realise how easy you can make it, it's quite technical. So that was really what made me think we need to start taking this more seriously. It was just a huge range of questions we were getting, and all in a really technical then.
So what services does the Podcast Host offer then to novices and to established podcasters?
Well, these days we used to do production and mentoring. So that was our big thing really in 2015 and going into 2016. But we've actually moved out of that now. We don't really do one-to-one. We don't do any of the actual editing and production anymore. We've moved into purely online education and really just providing the content as well. We have a set of courses which people can get access to. They're actually closed right now. We're opening them up again in February, at the end of February. So that's a subscription service. That's our kind of core educational product, I guess. But outside of that, really we're concentrating in this coming year on creating as much great free content as we can, because actually our business earns a lot of income through that free content, through advertising, through affiliate deals, through sponsorship. So we can create great stuff that we really believe in, that we hope gives value to the listener, and we can earn a living out of it as well without even charging people that much.
I saw that you were advertising for some people to join your team to podcast and to create content. I actually shared it on my own LinkedIn profile, and I said, this is like my dream job, only I'm too busy at the moment at my current business. So who are you looking for, and what are you looking for?
It's down to that focus on content. It's down to really want to ramp up what we do and put out there. We want somebody who is going to come in and help us really manage that content. Because right now, it's myself and Matthew are the full-time employees. We have a few part-timers as well who help us out a lot. But between the two of us, we get content out there, but we just don't have the time and the focus to really make sure we're sort of theming it all, we're strategizing months ahead of time, making sure that we're taking all of the input we're getting from our listeners, our audience, our viewers, and turning that into really targeted content. We feel a little bit scattergun, I suppose, at the moment. So what I want is really somebody who's going to come in and really give us a kick and plan things for us for the next, help us plan for the next 6 months and really make sure we're focused and strategizing exactly what we're doing so they can give as much value to our readers as we can.
So also on the show, I interviewed Owen, my producer, about tips to give somebody who's thinking about starting off and creating their first podcast or a podcast series. But I want you to maybe give some advice to established podcasters like myself. I've been podcasting now for 7 months, but that's on the back of a broadcast journalism career. Where do you take your podcast after you have it established, after you've built up, a small community of listeners? Where is there to go with our podcasts?
I think that's actually a really good question, because a lot of the teaching that is out there is around how to launch, how to start a podcast, and there's much less written about where to go once where, at that point where a lot of people think they hit a plateau, they feel like they don't have anywhere else to go. And I always think that once you reach that stage, so once you're in there, you're podcasting, you're getting stuff out every week, you're keeping consistent, the next stage for me is really doubling down on that user engagement. It's about really finding out who's in your community. So you build up to that 500 listeners, say, which is a good starting point. It's a sort of common place for people to be within 6 months or so. It's really finding out much more about those people and then starting to bring those people into the process of planning your show. Now, I talk a lot about seasons-based podcasting, and I do it for a couple of different reasons, but the best one, or one of the best ones, is the fact, is the ability it has to really involve your listeners in your podcast. So the principle behind it is that, you say yourself, you've done 30 episodes at the moment, you've got 30 episodes out there, you've built yourself an audience. You could take a pause now, maybe take 2 weeks off, send out a survey to your listeners and say, right, I'm going to do season 2. That was season 1 of my podcast. I want to move on to season 2, but I want to make it much more focused, much more concentrated on serving you guys, teaching you something really chunky, more than I can do in just one episode. And to do that, I need your help. I need to know what you're struggling with, what you think I should cover. And that really leads into tons of inspiration, which will then help you create, say, a 10, 15, 20 episode season of concentrated content, whereby you take them through a larger concept, topic by topic, episode by episode. And it leads to a bunch of different things. It leads to real addictive content, because it means that all your episodes are linked together. It means that people are actually ending on a cliffhanger on one episode, so they want to go to the next. It means that you're creating these big evergreen resources, because you end up with a big course of 10, 15 episodes that all goes together that you can use elsewhere as well. And importantly, because you've involved your listeners in it, you know that the content's going to hit the spot and they're going to feel really involved and engaged in it. And that's where I think you can push. Well, it's one of the ways that I think you can push beyond that rut and into the thousands of listeners and really start to grow a massive loyal audience.
That is super advice, Colin. So super. I'm actually going to take it on board. Thanks very much.
Excellent.
Now, you mentioned, having 500 listeners in your community, after 6 months is a really good benchmark and a goal that you should be looking to achieve. I asked you this on Twitter, and one of the reasons I wanted to get you on the show is, how do we measure our podcast metrics and those metrics that matter, like listeners, like downloads? It's not an exact science, is it?
No, not in the least. So there's a few things we suffer from in the podcasting industry, one of which is pretty unreliable metrics. We can predict, or we can measure downloads, because we can see how many people have actually downloaded that file or played that file online. So we can see to an extent how many people are listening to the show, but even that doesn't really mean listens. I mean, somebody could have downloaded it to their phone via subscription, but never actually listened to that episode. So it's unreliable. the way that I tend to recommend people measure stats, by all means, look at those download numbers. They give you an idea. They give you a good trend. If it's going up, it's a good thing. But really, it's engagement. It's all about people that actually engage with you. And you can drive it a few different ways. You can say on your podcast, for example, give them a real specific thing to ask you about, either on Twitter or on Instagram or wherever you engage with people, or via email. So if you set them that challenge and give them a real specific question to ask you, then you can start to measure how many people in your audience are actually taking action on whatever you say on your show. So say you say something like, right, for next episode, I'm going to talk about what type of microphones are best for podcasting. I want you to write in and say what microphone that you use for podcasting. So that's an ideal question for my audience. And I would see how many people get in touch. And if I have downloads of 500 people, say, and 50 people get in touch, then I've got a great engagement of 10%. 10% of the audience measured by my downloads are getting in touch. And that is the kind of data that really pushes a sponsor. They might say something like, well, 500 downloads isn't very much, but actually 10% of those downloads are actually actioning what he's asking them to do. That's how I tend to measure engagement. It's through that action. It's through them engaging with you, getting in touch and taking action on whatever it is that you ask them to do.
What about monetization, Colin? I know that I started the podcast not with money in mind or revenue generation in mind, but purely because of a passion and as an outlet to build an audience and to create more content. But what about those that are thinking about monetization at some level, whether it's sponsorship or affiliates? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's a few different stages. There's kind of a life cycle, I think, of monetization. The first one for me in the early days, the first thing people often think about is sponsorship, but you're not really, even if you go niche, even if you find a great sponsor that's willing to go with lower numbers because you're really engaged with your audience, you're still not going to really make it worthwhile until you're up to sort of 500 to 1,000 at a minimum. And most of the sponsorship companies, so agencies that deal with sponsorship, they're looking for sort of 3,000 to 5,000 listeners before they'll start to talk to your show. Now, I think you can make a decent bit of income, not a full-time income, but you can cover your costs and more with 1,000 listeners if you can prove that engagement. So you're not going by the standard click per meal, cost per meal, where you're only getting, say, $25 or so per 1,000 listeners. You can negotiate a much higher rate for sponsorship if you can show that high engagement. So that's the sort of second tier. Once you get up to, say, 1,000 listeners, you can start to look at that. You can start to search out sponsors that are really relevant to your listeners, sponsors that will actually offer value to your listeners. It's not just, a random company that actually doesn't really mean much to them, but it's products that are really interesting to them, exciting to them. So that's what you can do once you get to that stage. But the stage before that, this is the bit that people miss out for me, and it still can start to cover your costs, is a bit of affiliate income, actually. Because you can always act as if you've got sponsors just by setting up an affiliate deal. And the most basic one is Amazon. So for my show, for example, for podcasting, we can advertise microphones because there's lots of microphones for sale on Amazon. So I can act as if my podcast is sponsored by Shure. So I wouldn't say that, obviously, because that's a lie. But you can talk about a Shure microphone or a Zoom recorder and link to it on Amazon. And for every sale, you get a small commission. And for higher priced products, especially like microphones and the like, you can do a little bit of income that way. So that's where I would start. I would look at affiliate income, sell other people's products. Once you're up at 1,000, look at sponsorship. And beyond that, once you've got a bigger audience, start asking them what products they want you to create some of your own. And that's where you can really start to make a living.
Colin, brilliant advice. So thrilled to have met you on Twitter and now to have you on the show. So I really appreciate your time. If you are a budding podcaster or indeed building your podcast brand, be sure to follow Colin on Twitter at The Podcast Host and log on to thepodcasthost.com to see their range of courses. Colin, thanks very much, and I'm sure I will tweet you later.
Indeed, I will talk to you soon. All right, talk to you later.
Shoutouts.
In this part of the show, I give shoutouts to individuals or brands who are remarkable online and worth talking about. All 4 shoutouts on today's show go to my favourite podcasts. Did you know in the United States, those who consume podcasts on a regular basis listen to an average of 5 podcasts per week? Social Media Examiner is the world's biggest and most trusted social media website resource. They also have a weekly 45-minute social media marketing podcast, which shares success stories and expert interviews from leading social media marketing pros. Discover how successful businesses employ social media, learn new strategies and tactics, and gain actionable tips to improve your social media marketing. It's hosted by founder Michael Stelzner, and it's certainly worth subscribing to. Chris Drucker is a personal branding entrepreneur and is a seasoned podcaster with almost 200 shows under his broadcasting belt. Youpreneur FM brings you Chris's take on what it means to be a personal brand entrepreneur in the 21st century. Everything from building a personal brand to delegating like a king, right the way through to creating and launching online products and services, to marketing yourself as the go-to person in your industry and beyond. If you're a speaker, author, coach, consultant, expert blogger, podcaster, freelancer, or solopreneur, then Youpreneur FM will become your favourite podcast. Pat Flynn from the Smart Passive Income blog reveals all of his online business and blogging strategies, income sources, and killer marketing tips and tricks in his podcast. Discover how you can create multiple passive income streams that work for you so that you can have the time and freedom to do what you love, whether it's travelling the world or just living comfortably at home. Pat Flynn is an expert in this space, so make sure you tune in. Alan Swan's The Outer View is a great podcast. Alan was my very first interviewee on JSB Talks Digital. His podcast, The Outer View, is a collection of resources, opinions, and podcasts on the art of media interviewing. He explores what it takes to conduct the perfect interview, from dissecting classic interviews to discussing techniques with some of the world's leading interviewers. Let me know what your favourite podcasts are, and I certainly hope that JSB Talks Digital makes your list.
JSB's column.
In today's column, I thought I'd share my podcasting routine with you. So here's what it takes to deliver a weekly 20-minute show. Let me talk to you about consistency. I decided to release my podcast each and every Friday, and 7 months on, I'm sure my community would be able to tell you what day JSB Talks Digital is released. I made a commitment and I have delivered on it. To allow for holidays and busy times at work, I might have 2 podcasts in the bag, already recorded and produced. Moving on now to my podcast theme. I chose digital marketing as the topic for my podcast, given that's my day job and my big passion. I get through so much digital marketing and social media work each and every week that the podcast is almost like a cathartic outlet to practice what I preach and to share my knowledge. It also serves as a great way for me to keep my knowledge relevant and current. Now, let's move on to branding. Branding is so important online. Jamelia Daniels is my digital design and marketing executive at Digital Training Institute, and she oversees all branding at the business. So she created a logo for my podcast, which I absolutely love. We ensure we keep all design relating to the podcast consistent with the Digital Training Institute brand. Jingles. You have to have jingles on your podcast. So I customised our very own jingles for the show to ensure that we had our own sound. Galway native Owen Finnegan is my jingle creator, and as well as the show intro, he also created segment jingles. At Christmas, Owen pimped my jingles with some jingle bells and festive spells, which worked brilliantly. Let's just say we have fun on this podcast. Now, when it comes to recording, I record all my podcasts in the studios of Flirt FM on the campus at NUI Galway, where my office is located. I work with Owen Murphy and he engineers the show for me. So I simply have to produce the content, step into the studio and record. He also edits the show. Initially, I was going to have a monthly podcast, but I thought that was a bit lame. So I decided to go weekly. And as I said, in order to stay ahead of myself, I always try to have 2 shows already produced. In terms of my podcast schedule, I decided to produce a 20-minute show, not too long, not too short. I also drafted a schedule that I have kept to since the beginning and since the very first episode. As a former broadcast journalist and radio show host, I produced JSB Talks Digital just as I would a traditional radio show. The podcast has 7 key sections: the intro and what's coming up in the show, social media news, interview, shoutouts, JSB's column, social media tool of the week, and the outro. When it comes to interviews, each week I will interview a digital marketing or social media expert, a business owner, an academic, or an influencer, or somebody who can share their experiences with my community. You don't have to be a unicorn or a global influencer to be on the show. You simply have to have a story to tell that we can all learn from. So if you want to come on the show, drop me an email to joanne@digitaltraining.ie. Now, streaming your podcast. I stream JSB Talks Digital on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and I also embed it on my blog. I then share the podcast on my social networks, my Facebook page, my Facebook profile, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Twitter, Google+, and I also create a Snapchat story. Every 10 or 15 or so episodes, I will host a special Facebook Live show lasting about 45 minutes. I have guests in studio and then one on the phone. And we let people see my world of podcasting using Facebook's livecast service. I particularly love these shows as I get the adrenaline rush from being live. When I was a journalist, all my broadcasts and shows were live, and it does give you that adrenaline rush. So I really wanted to bring JSB Talks Digital into the live sphere, and I've leveraged Facebook Live for that. When it comes to promoting your podcast, I will of course share it on all my social networks, as I outlined above. I also send it to my 3,000 plus email subscribers in an e-zine every Friday morning. I will also schedule future social media posts about the podcast so that it gets repeat social shares. I also have my podcast subscribed on Blueberry, the world's largest podcast directory. Finally, let me come to statistics. It's important to me that I know how many people are listening to my podcast. It's not always possible to get the subscriber or download data from iTunes or Stitcher. However, I have been doing some calculations as follows. I embed my podcast every week on my blog, and from 29 podcast blog posts, I've had 22,328 views. On SoundCloud, my podcasts have had 1,655 plays, and the 2 Facebook live casts have had 2,412 video views. So, my friends, the total engagement with my podcast in the first 6 months is 28,807, and that's not too shabby.
Social media tool of the week.
My favourite podcasting tool is the Blueberry PowerPress Podcasting WordPress plugin. I use this tool to embed my podcast audio recordings into my blog posts. PowerPress is the #1 podcasting plugin for WordPress and is developed by podcasters for podcasters. Its features include simple and advanced modes, multiple audio or video player options, subscribe to podcast tools, podcast SEO features, and more. It also fully supports iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Blueberry podcasting directories, as well as all podcast applications and clients. So if you're podcasting and sharing it on your WordPress blog, then I'd highly recommend the Blueberry PowerPress podcasting plugin. Thanks as always for tuning in to JSB Talks Digital. To ensure you never miss an episode, make sure you subscribe on your smartphone, on iTunes or Stitcher. You can also subscribe on SoundCloud. Give me 20 minutes of your time each week, and in return, I will empower you with digital marketing and social media knowledge. If you're interested in becoming a guest on JSB Talks Digital or have an event you want to promote, simply drop me an email to joanne@digitaltraining.ie. If there's a topic you want me to cover, please tweet me at tweetsbyjsb or send me a snap to JSB Snaps. I'm Joanne Sweeney-Burke. This is JSB Talks Digital. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.
JSB Talks Digital.